Committee members, if you could take your seats, we will begin shortly. Committee members, I call this meeting to order. The time is a couple of minutes after 11. Welcome to meeting number 122 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disability. I will begin by reminding members to avoid audio feedback for the benefit and protection of our translators. Please follow the instructions that you were given a while back. Keep your mic actually shut off if you're not speaking, and located away from the boom. Also, if you could avoid tapping the boom while you're speaking, because it does give an echo or a noise to the translators. So please, if you could follow that, it would be great. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format according to the rules adopted by the committee, meaning members are appearing virtually and witnesses are appearing virtually and in the room. I would advise those appearing in the room to please wait until I recognize you by name. To do that, raise your hand and I will recognize you before you have the floor. Those appearing virtually, please use the raised hand icon on your surface and wait until I recognize you. As well, please understand that this meeting is taking place and you have the option of choosing the official language of your choice. Use the interpretation services available from the headset in the room. As well, if you're online, simply click on the globe icon on the bottom of your surface and choose the official language of your choice. If there is a breakdown or disruption in translation, please get my attention. We will suspend while it is being corrected. Those are the procedures of the committee today. As you're aware, committee members, when the committee concluded its last meeting, it was in the process of votes in the House. I must remind members that members in the committee have the right to choose to participate in person in the chamber to vote. And if they choose to do so, I will not resume the meeting until 10 minutes after the vote is called in the House. So with that, we did not get to question the following witnesses that were present. They all have been re-invited. But as of now, the clerk advised me we only have 2, although 4 did confirm. So with that, we have Abigail Bond, Executive Director, Housing Secretariat. And we have Bo Jarvis, President, Chief Executive Officer of West Group Properties. We're trying to connect with Mr. Marchand from the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. Those are the ones that indicated to come back. So as indicated on the meeting, we will go, there's no opening statements because they were able to do that at the last meeting. So we'll go directly to questioning round in this, the first hour of the committee business. So we'll begin. Mr. Aitchison, I have you listed as the first questioner today. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for coming back. We really appreciate that. I hope you've enjoyed your summer as much as I did. I want to start with Ms. Bond, if possible. Ms. Bond, in your testimony, you spoke at length about the lack of investment in housing, particularly rental housing, and that really, the privately and publicly owned rental homes in the city, in Toronto, were mostly built, 35 years ago. And I'm wondering if we could get to that and what it costs to build in the city of Toronto. We know that housing starts have dropped about 10% this year over last year in the city of Toronto, while development charges have gone up about 42%. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the committee about the cost of local fees and charges when they go up like that, what that means on the construction of new units?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. There are a number of things that are affecting the cost of building in the City of Toronto, including the increase in labor, inflation, and land costs as well. You're right to identify that there are development charges.
Excuse me, Madame Chabot?
The interpreter told us that the equipment was not appropriate for interpretation, so I don't have any interpretation into French currently.
Okay, excuse me, we'll suspend while we get this corrected. Suspend. going directly to questions, and we will resume with Mr. Aitchison, and Mr. Aitchison will start with the full 6 minutes for your line of questioning to the two witnesses that are now approved to participate.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Jarvis. Mr. Jarvis, thank you for coming back as well. We appreciate it. And Mr. Marchand, good to see you again as well. I want to start with you, Mr. Jarvis, though, kind of in the same line of the questions I was asking Ms. Bond in the City of Toronto with, development charges and the costs and fees of government. In terms of the cost of getting homes built and the speed with which we build them, can you speak to the cost of government at all levels and what impact that has on the construction of housing units?
Yeah, I can. Thanks for having me back today. Thanks for the question. It's having an extremely detrimental impact right now. And there's many reports, including from CMHC, the Urban Development Institute, to name a couple, that have indicated or have concluded that various forms of fees, levies, and taxation from all levels of government are up to 30% of the cost of new housing. In some cases, this is now 3 times what the private sector is taking the risk in trying to build new housing. These new costs are absolutely stifling our industry right now, and they are curbing new starts, which are notably down. And I think that we are calling for an analysis of how government is taxing new housing. We're also calling for in-stream protection from new fees and charges. We don't understand. There's no business in the world where it would be acceptable to have fees and charges rising after you've made an investment decision based on all of the information when you make that decision, including what the taxation regime is, including what the development fees are, community amenity contributions. And so it's something that has become increasingly alarming. We're looking at Metro Vancouver, which is our regional government here. They've increased their fees 1,900%. And you probably saw the current housing minister federally, Sean Fraser, come out on Twitter against that. That was unprecedented and quite welcome from our industry. But these fees are absolutely totally killing development right now.
And so, Mr. Jarvis, those fees in Metro Vancouver, how much do those fees add to the cost of every single unit you build?
They will be rising to $23,000 a unit on average, and that's just one level of government. And so what we do is we borrow money to pay those fees at today's interest rate, and we carry that to the end of the project and end up trying to pass that cost onto the purchaser. And then the federal government comes and adds GST or HST to that cost. So the federal government is taxing other levels of government's taxes. This whole setup is just entirely egregious. And we need to have an honest conversation about this. I think we've been talking about this now for almost a decade. It's great that it's finally has the lens on it that it does, but what are we going to do about it?
Can you quantify for the committee? I know it might be difficult because not every application is the same, but can you quantify for the committee how much it adds per units when you start the process of you start a process, you purchase a piece of land, and then you have to go through the municipal zoning and approvals process, and that can often take 5-6 years. Can you quantify how much that adds to the cost of every single unit?
The processing time?
Yes.
It adds a ton of cost to the unit. When we buy land and we take the risk on that, and we borrow money to pay for that land, and we carry that land through that process. In that time, along that continuum, we pay various fees to the cities. We pay for consultants to develop drawings for us, including architects, structural engineers, landscape architects. And so all along that timeline, we are incurring carrying costs And at the the cost of time today is greater than it ever has been. Obviously, we're in we're in a high interest rate environment. We're seeing those interest rates come down, but it's still that carrying time is absolutely contributing to the cost of new housing.
Is it fair to say then that governments make more money on housing than anybody else in the mix?
I would say it's absolutely fair to say that. That is an entirely accurate statement right now.
Thanks very much. Mr. Marchand, I don't have a lot of time, just about a minute, but I'm wondering if you could speak to, I know that the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Corporation has over 3,000 units. How many of those units, how many units are you building now that are under construction, and what's the greatest impediment to getting those units built?
Thank you, MP Aitchison. Yes, we have about 1,700 units under various stages of construction. But in terms of timelines, it takes anywhere from 3 to 8 years for the planning portion of development and only about 12 to 18 months for construction. So probably 80% of the time is spent on planning and approvals. And as we know, time is money, actual money, and that leads to higher rents or prices at the end of the day.
Okay, I think I'm pretty much out of time, but okay. I'll come back around, hopefully. Thanks very much.
Mr. Aitchison. Mr. Fragas-Catos for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. It's good to be back in Ottawa with colleagues. Hope everybody had a good summer. I'm going to begin with Mr. Marchand. There's a major investment that was recently announced, sir, in co-op housing, the largest investment that the country's seen in the past 30 years. I wonder if you could talk about the importance of that, but more to the point, how you, with your background, with your expertise, would want to see that invested.
Unfortunately, truthfully, I'm not overly familiar with co-op housing, but I can comment on the urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing plan that the previous housing minister had put forward. His National Housing Council called on the federal government to invest over $63 billion in urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. There was about $300 million, or less than 0.5% of that need that the Minister's Housing Council identified that was put forth 2 budgets ago. And I believe we're looking at, we're waiting for the rest of those funds to roll out. There was also $4 billion that was part of the $4 billion announcement 2 federal budgets ago, and about 7% of that funding has been committed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jarvis. I know that that strategy is one that has the potential to be quite transformational, and a lot of work has been done on it, including from stakeholders such as yourself. Can I ask you on public lands? The federal government recently announced a list of 56 lands that are owned by the federal government that have real potential for housing. Affordable housing in particular would be the focus. What do you think about that? How do you think public lands should be used? Some have suggested that they should be sold outright. The view of the government is, wherever possible, that those lands be leased in order to ensure affordable rates of rent. I'm wondering what you think.
And just confirming this was a question.
Oh, sorry, this is to Mr. Marchand.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of public lands, as an Indigenous organization, we believe in planning 7 generations out. The public lands that have been offered on a leasehold basis, which is quite ironic, offering that to a number of nonprofits, but particularly to Indigenous organizations. 99 years is not 7 generations, nor that, it's also, as I said, very, very ironic thing to do. From a very practical perspective and looking at it from a financing perspective, the last thing that we want to do is set up future generations for failure. And what I mean by that, we also want to set up future generations for opportunity. And what I mean by that is, let's say if they were on fee simple lands, using that British legal terminology, if it was on fee simple lands, after about 15 to 20 years of paying down a mortgage, there'd be substantial equity in that development. for which nonprofits would be able to access that equity either with or without government funds or very minimal government funds. We would be able to self-service new units after just one generation. If the federal government is beholden to a leasehold situation, we will not be able to access that equity, and that equity will sit dead, not allowing us to add future units. So I would suggest that the federal government strongly look at a transfer of land, in particular to Indigenous nonprofit groups, that will set us up for the best opportunity to improve self-reliance over time and allow us to use Canada's financial institutions as a tool to help us do that in a way that is not always using government funds, frankly.
Thank you. I have about a minute and a half left. Mr. Jarvis, you know that the federal government some time ago now went forward with lifting GST off of the construction costs for purpose-built rentals. Some have suggested, not outright, but omission is a suggestion of a particular type, that they would reintroduce that the GST. What would be the effect of that on building?
I think that, first of all, GST should be removed on all housing. We shouldn't be charging that tax on all housing. As I said earlier, you're charging GST on other levels of government's taxes. The removal of GST on purpose-built rental was an extremely positive step in the right direction. Unfortunately, you missed including the exemption of GST on existing projects that have been struggling through the pandemic and the financial crisis to get delivered. And most of the capital is trapped in those projects. We advocated for this in a significant way, and it was missed. So this benefit really isn't coming to fruition until 3 to 4 years from now when projects are complete. But again, it is absolutely a step in the right direction. And if it was reinstituted, it would be absolutely detrimental to the development and construction and delivery of new purpose-built rental housing.
1 second, and it's gone. Thank you, Mr. Fragas-Caddis. Now, Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We know that there was an abrupt end in June for you, but now we have the opportunity to ask questions about the thorny issue of housing. Mr. Marchand, during your testimony regarding the community you represent, you referred to 2 important reports, including one from the HUMA Committee, which was the report on Indigenous housing, which sought to present a housing strategy, the Reaching Home report for urban and remote and rural housing by and for Indigenous people. We were supposed to see a report on progress on that strategy. To your knowledge, the strategy that was supposed to be put in place, does it meet the current needs of your communities?
No, that strategy is not meeting the needs of our communities. As I had mentioned earlier, the previous housing minister's National Housing Council identified a $63 billion need, and 300 million of that, actually 281.5 million, because CMHC took 18.5 million off the top of that. We're not sure for what, but 281.5 million of that has been committed, so less than 0.5% of the identified need. I'll speak to numbers in Ontario. In Ontario, less than 3% of the population are Indigenous people, yet in Southern Ontario, 20 to 30% of people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous. And in Northern Ontario, that climbs to 90 to 99+% of people experiencing homelessness. Yet the pro rata share of existing federal housing investments is almost negligent compared to that total investment. It behooves me why, when in that national housing strategy, Prime Minister Trudeau in the very first part of that strategy said that there is no relationship more important than our relationship with Indigenous people. Yet it took 7 years after the beginning of that national housing strategy to even acknowledge one of the highest need demographics out there, and that being the 86% of Indigenous people who live off reserve. So that direction has been extremely slow and extremely painful, while we continue to see people on the street, and overwhelmingly those people that are on the street are Indigenous.
Merci, Monsieur Marchand. Je vais vous reposer une autre question.
Thank you, Mr. Marchand. I have another question for you. I find it deplorable, the situation, as you do, because for the HUMA committee, that report, Reaching Home, was a major landmark report. It sought to support Indigenous people in rural and urban and remote areas. So count on us to follow up on that. Well, you can count on me. You also said in your testimony that the program, the rapid creation of units, out of the 10,000 of the two first series, only 12 went to Indigenous providers. How can that be explained?
That's a good question, but probably one that you'll have to ask CMHC. We had explained to them on multiple occasions why that rapid housing initiative would be exclusionary to urban Indigenous housing providers, and it very much was. And I just want to be clear that there was 12 units that were provided to urban Indigenous housing providers. There were other units that were funded on reserve, but as I mentioned, overwhelmingly 86% of Indigenous people live in urban and rural areas who are looking for employment, education, safe drinking water, an opportunity for their children. But overwhelmingly, that population is disproportionately represented in need in a number of different metrics besides homelessness as well.
Il y a eu beaucoup de recommandations.
There were many recommendations, a lot of testimony here indicating that to deal with homelessness and the housing crisis, we needed to invest 30%, an increase of 30% in social and community housing. Do you agree with that?
Monsieur Marchand.
Mr. Marchand.
Actually, Scotiabank in 2023, and by the way, we do absolutely believe that this is going to have to be a multi-stakeholder approach, including private investment. The federal government is not going to be able to do this on their own. But Scotiabank issued a report last spring that indicated Canada is at the bottom of G7 countries in terms of a pro rata share of social housing. Canada would need to double the amount of social housing to over 400,000 units just to be average. And I find it very disturbing that that other countries, including the United States, invest more dollars in the populations that are being left behind than Canada. To say that, for Scotiabank, to set a goal of Canada, a goal or a suggestion of Canada being just average, does not seem particularly inspirational. But here we are at the bottom of the G7 in yet another measurement.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Chabot. Madame Zerillo, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank Mr. Marchand for his most important testimony today, and my questions will also be directed at Mr. Marchand, because the testimony that he is bringing forth today is the most important testimony that I've seen in this study so far. I just wanted to make a note before I ask Mr. Marchand some questions. Just shame on the Liberal government, shame on the Liberals for coming to this committee and trying to take a victory lap on their investments when we can see that they're holding back money that's already been allocated for Indigenous housing. They're holding it back. We heard testimony today that less than 10%, around 5% of that money is going out. I know my own colleague was working on this file, Jenny Kwan. I mean, this for Indigenous, by Indigenous, the money needs to go out the door. So as I sit in committee today, I'm going to say to the Liberals, as they sit there smug, making comments about how awesome they are, that money needs to go out the door. I have the floor. Thank you so much. Oh, and now they're offended that they feel insulted. Guess what? 299 times housing was mentioned in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report. And the federal government is trying to come to this committee and take a victory lap on the little amount, dribbles of money that have come out. My apologies, Mr. Marchand, but I really appreciate your testimony today. In your opening remarks, Mr. Marchand, you discussed the hollowing out of federal investments and the lack of proactive commitment to an urban Indigenous housing policy. And Mr. Marchand, this may be a difficult question, but I wanted to ask you, how has racism against Indigenous people affected the federal investments with this Liberal government, the Conservative governments before them?
Well, I think perhaps the way to answer that question is speaking to the data and to the need. As I mentioned, at a low end, if you look at the people experiencing homelessness in Southern Ontario, 20 to 22% at the low end of the people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous. And if we're quoting a 80 or $90 billion housing strategy, and we've committed $300 million to that strategy, that's less than 0.2% of resources being allocated, the low end, to a population of people that represents 20 to 22% of the homelessness. If you look in centers like Winnipeg or Vancouver, Northern Ontario, various other parts, it's easy to get to 2/3 to 90% of the people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous. Even among those who are currently housed, the need among Indigenous people is twice that of mainstream. So according to the government's own stats, about 13 to 14% of people experiencing housing need are, that's the population of people experiencing housing need mainstream. Indigenous people have twice the incidence of need. And yet here we are with a 0.2% allocation. The numbers, unfortunately, resources are disproportionately allocated to need, or they're not allocated to need at all. And it's not something that I understand why that's the case. To me, if there was any group or population of people that were in need, you would allocate your resources, particularly in an era of truth and reconciliation, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report that you mentioned, which we know housing is both a preventative measure and a solution to ending violence. And yet we aren't allocating existing resources, never mind what's actually needed above and beyond that. But for some odd reason, we don't allocate resources according to need. And it's quite, it befuddles me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Marchand. And I did want to reflect on, your testimony that you did talk about the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry, and that 299 times housing was mentioned, and that 10 of those calls for justice referring to housing were there. Can you tell me how many of those 10 references to housing in the calls for justice have been completed by either the Liberal or even a Conservative government?
Well, it's been this federal government that put the national housing strategy in place and that supported the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report. I am not aware of any specific housing allocation to specifically address in a meaningful way housing needs for Indigenous women and girls. Here again, it's an opportunity to reverse that very real reality for our urban and rural and northern communities. We know that if people don't have safe, affordable housing, they will be put themselves in very tenuous situations, or they will continue to be in tenuous situations. We know that it's much more cost effective to help people from a preventative viewpoint rather than a reactive viewpoint. And if we can provide...
Mr. Marchand, your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Zarrillo. Ms. Gray, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My first questions are for Mr. Jarvis. In your opening statement, you talked about, even though Canada is in the midst of a housing crisis, that large home developers are building much more housing now outside Canada, and that is driving home builders out of Canada. Is this due to higher construction costs, which include lower Canadian dollar and high lumber costs due to Canada not negotiating a softwood lumber agreement and increasing carbon taxes on transportation, or higher government taxation, or more government bureaucracy and red tape, or all of the above?
I'd say it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's kind of all of the above. But in general, I think that the narrative in this country, so first of all, I think we need to understand the fact that 95% of all housing, including much of the non-market portfolio of housing in our country, is delivered by the private sector, including private capital. And there's this general narrative that that's wrong, or that developers are evil. It demonstrates to me that there's a complete lack of understanding by our government and our policymakers and our politicians as to how housing is delivered in Canada. And we can have a separate conversation about how appropriate that is or not, but that's how it is today. And we're in the midst of a housing crisis. And you ask why large Canadian home builders are built in the midst of a housing crisis in our country, are building more housing in other countries or in the United States than they are in Canada. The answer is simple. They don't feel very invited here. The risk-reward conversation has completely flipped. We are not attracting capital. We are not an attractive place to do business. Building housing is one of the riskiest businesses on the planet, and the risk-reward has completely flipped. I point you to the National Housing Council, pretty important body. On the website, Shaping the Future of Housing in Canada Through Participation and Inclusion. The members of the council, it doesn't include one single private sector developer, notwithstanding that 95% of housing is built by the private sector. It says the strength of the council comes from its members' diversity, experience, and expertise. And this is the same council that put out a report that is titled The Financialization of Purpose-Built Rental Housing. One of their key recommendations was transactions involving the purchase or refinancing of existing purpose-built rental between private sector entities should not be eligible for federal funding, lending, or support, which is entirely contradictory with what CMHC is doing right now with the RCFI and ACLP program, which stimulated the most amount of purpose-built rental supply, including non-market, in the last several decades. This demonstrates to me that nobody knows what's going on here. Thank you.
Th-
sorry for
thank
my
you very
passion.
much. No, I really appreciate that, and I want to get through a few more questions here to you as well. Are the Liberal capital gains tax increases going to make investment in building houses go down?
Absolutely, yes. We are already seeing land transactions slow down as a result of the increased capital gains tax. I use the example of the little strip mall that everybody is familiar with on the corner where a transit station was landed nearby and it's now a high density housing site. That families owned that strip mall for 30 years. They already were struggling with the capital gains equation when selling that land for redevelopment. Now it's a non-starter. We're seeing it happen already. The capital gains tax, there was no consideration given to the impact of housing and the cost of land for housing in that whole sort of policy framework.
How many housing units do you think Canada will be losing out on as a result?
Tough to say. I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer because there's so many things that are currently going on that are slowing the delivery of housing.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to ask a few questions here for Mr. Marchand. I want to ask you about funding that may come through the federal government's housing agency, the CMHC. And I've heard requirements to access funding through this federal government's housing agency is that organizations have to build far in excess of the excess of the standard building code. And this can add thousands, if not tens of thousands, to any project. So have you experienced this? And if so, do you have any sense as to how much cost this would add per square foot, per unit, or per project?
Sure, yes, that's absolutely true. Not having a number in front of me, but I would estimate that it would probably add in the neighborhood of at the low end, probably 7 to 8% on of the total cost, and on the upper end, it could be if you were going to a net zero standard, could be up to 15+% per unit.
Wow, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mr. Marchand. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, you have the floor.
Thanks.
5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Marchand, welcome back to the committee. I was in the riding in March for a funding announcement for the Bindigan Wellbeing Center. That's in my riding, and I think your organization may be attached to that. I think that the new units will be part of your, I think you're at 2,500, 2,600 units that you manage across the province in terms of social housing units. Is that correct?
3,100 units in total.
There you go. I stand corrected. So I was going to ask Ms. Bond this question, and I had intended to ask it to you as well. So in terms of supportive housing, my community tomorrow will talk about what they're doing with encampments locally. And you talked about earlier, you referenced housing with supports, and I think that is the path forward for many of the challenges that we're facing with our housing crisis, including encampments and those who are living rough. It's not a strictly transactional relationship anymore. When I lived in the social housing units that are directly behind your Bindigan development, I would walk with my mother to the local office for our social housing provider, and she'd provide the check, and that was our relationship unless we had a small problem in our unit. Those times have changed, and landlords are almost social workers for many of their tenants who have life challenges, and your organization, I know, provides those tenant supports to tenants who need them. I raised Bindigan because it is a very unique facility in that it provides health supports. It will provide housing on site for people who are on our social housing wait list. And I think it highlights the intersection between supports that tenants need across the country, not just in my riding in Hamilton East Stony Creek, but across the country. And I was hoping you could share with us, how programs such as the one that we've invested in and the project that we've investigated in, need to support those two areas, knowing that housing providers, especially nonprofit affordable housing providers, sometimes struggle with providing those special supports that their tenants need.
Sure, yes, thank you for that question. Speaking for those that are most, that have the acutest needs, in Ontario, there's anywhere from 100 to 200,000 people every night who experience homelessness. going to speak to it more from a financial perspective, which may seem odd than a person perspective. I would hope or think that people could understand the need to have a house. I mean, just it's it's the foundation, unintended, if you will, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, clothing, shelter, and not everyone has that. From a financial perspective, it is far more costly to deal with homelessness in a reactive manner using our frontline heroes like paramedics, police officers, firefighters, to deal with homelessness. And they're not correct. They're not, they're not equipped to deal with homelessness. Our doctors and nurses that have people visiting emergency rooms 200 plus times a year, that's an expensive and inappropriate use of services. What the solution to homelessness is housing. We need to build a lot more housing of all kinds, and it's not just at the for those who are homeless, but there's a huge number of people who are low middle income that cannot afford, for many of the reasons mentioned today, that cannot afford housing of any type. Market rentals are out of reach for low and middle income people, and that cost inflation, for the reasons that my colleague Mr. Jarvis has noted, are very real, and it impacts the price of housing for the people that want to purchase that housing in the market.
Can I ask
Again,
Mr.
Yes.
Can I ask Mr. Marchand, in terms of many of our programs support not just housing, but wraparound services for those people who are either living rough or otherwise. Reaching Home's a great example. We provide that on a portfolio approach. Our encampment fund that we've announced that will be cost shared by the provinces and territories. As someone who is helping people with sometimes addictions and mental health issues, can you talk about why our housing investments, and I mentioned a couple of them, more so than ever need to include some of those other services, not just the traditional brick and mortar that governments have provided in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. Homelessness is sometimes, not always, but sometimes a symptom of other issues or other causes. And I say that while also noting that vacancy rates are at an all-time low. So you may not have mental health and addictions issues. You simply cannot find a place to rent or buy. So those additional supports that you mentioned are absolutely needed. People do fall on hard times sometimes, and sometimes we need to make sure they get the appropriate support to help lift themselves back up again. And that often is not necessarily needing a police officer or a paramedic or a doctor at an emergency room to help them with certain needs that they might have at a particular point in time in their life. And
Thank you,
we
Mr.
need more
Marchand.
than just the bricks and mortar. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et 30.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Chabot. Thank you. Mr. Marchand, what would your definition be that should appear in the different federal programs, the definition of affordable housing? The question is often raised. There's a distinction between affordable housing and social housing. The definition of affordable can be varied, but housing is a right. So according to you, what would be the appropriate definition in housing strategies for affordable housing?
Yeah, interesting question. All housing is affordable to somebody. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sold and it wouldn't be purchased. I'm going to go back and speak to those people and families who are in highest needs, and I'm going to refer back to that Scotiabank report. When we have executives of our largest banks, and by the way, it hasn't just been Scotiabank, When we have our largest banks saying to Canada, you need to take care of everyone, and you need to double the amount of social housing, of deep core housing, just to get to the G7 average. That means going from 220,000 units of deep core housing to 440,000 units of deep core housing, which will be built and can be financed, by the way, by our private sector partner. It will all be built by our private sector partners. There's opportunity for it to be financed by our private sector, supported by government, managed by nonprofits like ourselves. We do need that all Team Canada approach, but we need to double the amount of deep core housing and build another 220 units just to get to the average. We need more housing, and it needs to be focused based on the needs of the people who are without.
Microphone, please.
Habilité par
So, based on personal revenue and not median income as we see in communities, do you agree with that?
Monsieur Marchand.
Mr.
Very much been the 60-year definition of deep core housing in Canada, and it's one that's being used by our big banks. This is a cross-sector, political acknowledgement that there is a segment of our population, and this is market economics 101, that not everyone is served by the market. As Mr. Jarvis indicated, absolutely, the majority of our housing in Canada is provided by the market, and we should absolutely not tax that. We should be out of the way. If we want more of something, we don't add more taxes to it. And the market will continue to provide the majority of housing to Canadians. But the market, by definition, does not serve everyone.
Thank you,
that's
Mr. Marchand.
By our big banks as well, too.
Thank you, Mr. Marchand. Madame Chabot, Madame Zarillo for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, my questions are going to be for Mr. Marchand. And Mr. Marchand, almost 10 years ago, Shannon Daube, who co-authored the report Red Women Rising, came to see Metro Vancouver, the Indigenous Relations Committee at Metro Vancouver. And I can remember her saying in her presentation that no woman should be homeless on their own land. And within the report, there was a quote that said, "Nothing changes because our lives are not valued and because people think violence against us is normal," and how it is. So you mentioned in your initial statements that federally there is no long-term plan to address the end of operating agreements. And as a result, we are witnessing expected displacements of residents from their own and from their once stable subsidized housing. And I added that piece about the stable subsidized because that's what the operating agreements held for. And an increase in homelessness and growing encampments. So my question is, how did the federal government walking away from those operating agreements, which we all knew were coming to expiration, we all know how long they are and how soon they're coming for expiration, how did that impact Indigenous women, and how does the government avoid repeating this in the future?
Thank you for that question. So, those programs that you're referring to were built by the private sector, financed by the private sector, underwritten by CMHC as a mortgage insurer, because that's what they are, and frankly, in my opinion, should be, and managed by the nonprofit sector. Those 30, 35, 40-year agreements have come to an end and are coming to an end, and it will create more homelessness. In Ontario, over 35% of urban Indigenous deep core housing units have been lost. That means over 2,100 people will end up showing up on the streets. The other 65% of those units are at the tail end of their operating agreements with no firm plan in place other than potential year-to-year rent subs, which is actually not what's needed. It's a Band-Aid solution in the middle of a housing crisis, and it's decreasing the available supply of the housing that's needed for those most in need.
Marchand, that concludes. I'll go to the official opposition, whoever is, for 5 minutes, and then we will conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Marchand, back to yourself. I've also heard that even though a project meets all requirements, has a building permit and maybe even an occupancy permit, the federal government's housing agency then requires an organization to hire a quantity surveyor and or an energy consultant to test door seals, for example, on already met building code doors. And these can cost thousands more, often in smaller and rural communities as well, who don't have consultants readily available in their communities. This will bring in extra costs added on for them. So have you experienced something similar? And if so, how much more would this add per project in your estimation?
Sure. So just that one example that you mentioned, we've seen it add up to 6 months on top of an already 3 to 8 year schedule. So, and depending on when that 6 months happens, it might mean that we miss a construction season, which is a full year. In terms of costs, I'm going to say on a typical 40 unit development, it might be 100 to 150,000, which, you know, is a third of a unit. And when you start multiplying that over the number of units that, you know, we're trying to build, it does mean less supply being built.
So when you're looking at the numbers that you gave earlier with respect to the addition of over above building code requirements, plus these additional consultants that are needed to come in that are being required by the government's housing agency, we're talking on a project. Based on what you're saying, hundreds of thousands of project and many percent, well over, you have said 15%, and then now adding this on would even be higher, that is adding to the cost and potentially delays that are coming from the government's housing agency. It sounds like you're rowing in one direction, trying to get affordable housing out the door and being built, and yet the government is rowing in the opposite direction. Does that seem like what it seems like?
Yeah, absolutely. And if it makes sense, if it makes financial sense to spend more money on building higher efficient units over the long term, whether it's private market or nonprofit, like private builders and private financing will be available to finance those initiatives. So it doesn't have to come at the force of government for that to happen.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm going to turn over the rest of my time to Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague. Mr. Jarvis, I'd like to turn back to you. In your presentation, you talked a lot about the importance of increasing densities in urban centers, in and around transit, for example, and that, of course, it's among the more expensive ways to build and places to build, and yet we need to do it. But there are an awful lot of, impediments to doing that, whether it's local park charges and fees, whether it's the federal government and their taxation policies. Can you give us like a minute and a half of all the things that we should be doing to incentivize the construction of higher density residential in existing urban areas and why that's important?
Sure. I think that there's generally been a downloading of land use regulations to local municipal governments for good reason. The constituents are local and the politicians are local. I think the issue is that transit funding and infrastructure funding often comes from more senior levels of government, and there's been a lack of connection with that investment in transit infrastructure in particular and housing outcomes. Because if we're going to be investing transit infrastructure in urban centers and putting large transit stations in, that's absolutely from a sustainability perspective where housing should go. To make it easier, I think we need to start to use metrics to identify outcomes. So the province of British Columbia is actually going in the right direction there. They're forcing municipalities to create housing needs reports, and then they're going to be following up with municipalities to identify outcomes. And I think that we absolutely have to be using metrics. We have not been doing that. The other thing is the low-hanging fruit here is all government, we are calling for a policy moratorium. Right now, we're building a building under Code A. We're designing at the same time a new building under Code B. and policymakers are making up code C all at the same time. We can't operate that way. We have to stop the policy. Just give us some breathing room, okay? So we need to figure out taxation and we need to figure out policy, and we need a moratorium of both. That is how we're going to get housing built. The private sector doesn't need to be subsidized. It doesn't need to be incentivized. It needs to be enabled. And that is we just need to build housing for Canadians.
Just Mr. Jarvis, to conclude is Mr. Long, and then we'll conclude this section. Mr. Long?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, good afternoon to our witnesses, and it's good to see all my colleagues across the horseshoe. Just a few comments. We, as a government, have leaned in and put our shoulder to the wheel on housing, and I sometimes step back and marvel at the criticism we do take on something that really is provincial jurisdiction. And, certainly in the Maritimes, I have conservative premiers in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Clearly, Premier Ford in Ontario, and conservative premiers really across the prairies in the West. And, again, I'll say it's provincial jurisdiction, and I'm particularly proud of the programs that we have put forth as a government. Are they perfect? No. Can they be tweaked, and could they be better? Sure. But you know what? We did step up, and we stepped in when leadership was needed on the housing file right across the country. And, whether it's the Rapid Housing Initiative, the old co-investment initiative, different CMHC loan programs. Let's put on record, the Conservative Party voted against each and every one of those programs. They also voted against recently the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. They voted against that program. So, I think, sure, we can take criticism and constructive feedback, but when we're criticized at times for trying to lean in and help, I think it's unfair and unwarranted. And, I remember back in 2015, the NDP with, their leader, Thomas Mulcair, promising balanced budgets. I mean, he put forth in that program, I remember their election program or platform was $250 million for housing across the country. I mean, $250 million wouldn't build housing in half of a city. So, again, we can take criticism, but I think we also deserve a lot of credit for the initiatives and the leadership we have done on housing across this country. And I would like to now turn my time over to MP Morris. Thank you.
2 seconds.
Thank you, MP Long. Appreciate the chance to participate in the conversation. My question is for Mr. Marchand. Mr. Marchand, I really appreciated you speaking to the reality with respect to where we stand for social housing around the world. The fact that we're the bottom of the G7 right now, and even if we doubled, we'd still just be middle of the pack. My question is with respect to a proposal that I heard this summer from Habitat for Humanity. They noted that builders of purpose-built rental housing have HST, GST waived, but those that are building nonprofit affordable ownership don't. And I wonder if this might also help groups like KW Urban Native Wigwam Project in my community that you might be familiar with that are also building Indigenous housing. Can you comment on your thoughts on the possibility of the federal government applying the same waiving of HST for nonprofit affordable home ownership as well?
Yes, thank you for that. And that's been a bit of a sore point as well too. We still pay a portion of as nonprofits, we still pay a portion of the HST on new homes. And just by way of rough estimate, I can tell you that on let's call it a $400,000 build, we will pay about $5,600 in HST that is not refundable on a build on each unit. So on a 40-unit development, that'll be one unit that we can't build because we're paying the government HST on an affordable housing development.
Mr. Marchand, in my case, in my community, it was Habitat who could have built an extra 45 affordable townhouses if they didn't have to pay HST, and we could recover that cost. The federal government could if Real Estate Investment Trust didn't have their tax break. So you could find the revenue through the tax breaks that REITs get in order to help yourself and others build these affordable units. Thanks for that, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. And with that, I want to, that concludes the first hour. I want to thank the witnesses for, again, taking your time to appear before UMA and address the issues on this file that are important for you. So again, thank you for taking your time and being available to meet with UMA. So with that, I'm going to adjourn this section of the meeting. Meeting adjourned, meeting suspended for 5-minute health break, and then we'll resume with in-camera.